Hi, Rory at Claude Painting Studio. This video is continuing the project started in the last one, which is to demonstrate the levels of finish I offer in my commission service. So we had some 28mm metal Perry British Napoleonic line infantry troops in their Peninsular War uniform with the stovepipe shako. This one was done to what I call standard detail, and then this one was done to high detail. I have a third model, which is going to be done to display level finish. The process is going to be a bit different from the last two models. I'm going to do a lot more blending between shades. For example, I have some Carmine red from Vallejo here, and some Scarlet from Vallejo. And I'm going to mix more of the Scarlet into the Carmine red to gradually lighten the shade, so we have a nice transition from the darkest parts to the lightest. I'm using a DIY wet palette. This is simply a bit of kitchen sponge with some water sitting on a lid of a Tupperware dish, and this is some baking parchment. Professional products are available, but I've never had a problem using this before. Models had a bit of a different prime. The last one, which was just all white, there's a first layer of some khaki from Halfords, and then from above I sprayed some white from Colourforge, and this just helps add a little extra lighting to the model. Imagine the sun's coming from above, so the surfaces on top will be a bit brighter, and the white will help show that difference. So I'm going to base coat the jacket with some of Carmine red, and then we'll come back once that's done to look at how I start layering on the mix up to a pure scarlet finish. So we're moving up the track of Carmine red to Scarlet. And leaving the Carmine red in the deepest recesses. It's probably going to be 3 or 4 sort of intermediate steps before I apply pure scarlet at the end. And it is handy to let the paint dry between stages, so you don't end up moving around half dry paint and adding a texture to the cloth. I've been through the intermediate stages with the Scarlet and Carmine red mix, gradually just adding the mixture to the highest points. And this is the pure Scarlet now. So that's been hitting the areas which are going to get the most of the light, so things that are sticking out furthest from the body. Some situations you might find that there's areas that need to be a bit more shadowed. And what I will be doing later on in the process is adding shading, not just to the red coat, but also around the straps. So we'll come back to the jacket later. Next process is going to be for the overalls, the trousers. which will be similar, starting with a Bonewhite from Game Colour and adding in ivory up to pure ivory. This is the third layer of ivory mixed into Bonewhite. And up till now, practically everything has been getting a coat, apart from some of the very deepest recesses, such as round about the tear in the knee, this seam down the outside. But now the focus is going a bit more on areas that are going to be catching more light. And as I continue this process, there will be less and less paint getting applied, and it will really just be small points on the very tips of folds. And this leg here, which is more or less under the body, I'm probably going to stop the highlighting on it about now. It's going to be receiving less light than the other leg, and therefore would look a little bit darker. And this sort of right knee prominence is going to be the lightest area of all. So another layer of the mix and then pure ivory. We'll come back and see how that looks. Just want to show off how thin the paint is, the pure ivory at this stage. Mixed in a lot of water there, almost 50-50. Having very wet paint at this stage means that you're going to get a bit more translucency of the layers below. And that is all useful for hiding the transitions between the different colours and different layers. But you're a long time to get to this point. I've decided that I'd like a bit more shade in this seam, so I've got some Army Painter Light Tone, one of their washes, mixed 1-to-1 with Quick Shade Mixing Medium. Just adding a little to some of the deeper folds. The top of the overall's hiding underneath the turn back on the jacket. And the crotch is not going to be receiving much light either. So targeted application of thin washes can be done again and again if necessary to really darken a shade. I've gone for light tone, but if I wanted a particularly dark area of shadow, then strong tone could be used. Or a few coats of light tone to really build up some shading slowly so you don't overdo it. Targeted shading takes longer than applying it over a whole area, but you get the added element of control, and you don't undo all the hard work you've put in up to that point either. Onto the black areas. I don't often use pure black, as I like to be able to shade darker colours with a bit of black wash, but in this case we are starting from matte black from Army Painter. I've thinned it out a bit with some water, so when I've applied it, it has flown more into the recesses, and that helps mark out the shading. The actual colour that I'm going to use, I'll take some of this Army Painter Wolf Grey and mix that in. And eventually the final highlight colour is going to be pure Wolf Grey. So that's almost black, and we'll start with that colour. And so on over pack and a bayonet sheath and shackle. So I've been building up the highlights of the black with our black and wolf grey mixture, and I've got the pure wolf grey. Really just looking at very fine points. We're looking at the finest points on corners where light might catch. We might also have a bit more wear of the leather on the shoes. So the toes of the boots could be lightened up to represent that. I'm going to tackle the musket next. And I'm going to be working from Vallejo flat brown through to beige brown for the highlights stroke wood grain on the musket. I applied some black to this earlier for areas that are going to have the metallics applied later. I'll also try and leave some of the black as a defining line between wood and metal as well. This is the pure beige brown. Not that much of the musket visible on this model, but with this size 0 brush, just adding a bit of a wood grain effect to the butt. Previously the canteen was done the base coat of crystal blue, and that's what I've done again. So I'm using another Army Painter colour, some deep blue, to shade this. So it's pretty thin, this paint going on, and that just aids its flow into the recesses. The facing colour for this regiment, I'm using some Vallejo Russian green as previous, so applying that to the collar and in between the lace on the cuffs. Always handy to have a couple of colours on the palette ready to go when you're waiting for something to dry before layering it. So one advantage of the wet palette is that you've got a lot of working time to work with other colours. I have added some Void Shield blue from Army Painter to the crystal blue. Initial highlight there. Switching to a 3-0 brush with pure Void Shield blue. Add in further highlights and also a hint of wood grain. The highlight for the facing colour is Army Painter Army Green. So you might have noticed the pack, the greatcoat on top of the pack had some of the thin black applied. I've used this to provide the shading in the rolls and also either side of the straps. And the mix that I'm going to use is neutral grey. It's going to be mixed into Game Colour Stonewall Grey. I'm going to try and leave the black lines. There's some very distinct lining around the strap. I didn't apply the black all over, so that up at the top where the light's hitting, we had a white base, and that should mean it dries lighter than where the black was applied. Ready for the final highlight of the pure Stonewall Grey. I am going to use true metallics on this model rather than a non-metallic metal process. And the base colour for the brass areas is some Vallejo Game Colour Tinny Tin, which is the same as the old Citadel tin bits. The base colour for the musket barrel buttons is some Vallejo Gunmetal Grey. This is Vallejo Brass. You'll try and leave the tinny tin in the recesses on the shackle plate. Highlighting towards the edge on this plate over the straps. And next out the pot is some Army Painter Gunmetal. Problem sometimes with different manufacturers sharing names is that you have two totally different shades of paint. Army Painter Gunmetal much lighter than Vallejo Gunmetal Grey. The first layer of highlighting of the metal to be done with this and then be back for the final metallic highlights. This is Vallejo Gold. And for the steel and white metal, I've got some Vallejo Game Colour Silver. The strap for the water bottle is getting a base coat of Vallejo Chocolate Brown. And this continues on the front of the torso. Highlight for the leather is the chocolate brown with increasing amounts of flat earth added to it, both Vallejo colours. Next job is going to be the white straps, turnbacks lace. Obviously they're a bit white from the undercoat, so that's a good start, but they're not very well defined from each other. So on my brush I've got a little bit of Army Painter Strong Tone, and that's been diluted 1:1 with Quick Shade Mixing Medium. And where the straps are overlapping each other, I'm going to lay down some of this strong tone. This helps to define the individual straps. I also said earlier that any areas on the jacket that look like they could do with extra shading would get some later on, and that's where I'm going to use this strong tone. So under the arm, around the lace where we've got some of the red, that could all be darkened. So I'll define all the edges of the straps, and once that's dry we'll start painting the straps in. Painting some Stonewall Grey onto the straps, I'm trying to avoid the areas where the strong tone has settled and left a nice line to demarcate these areas. And to highlight this, I'm adding increasing amounts of white from coat d'arms. I'm back with the 3-0 brush for these last few highlights with the pure white. Perhaps one thing that's wildly different from previous models is when it comes to painting the skin. I won't actually be using anything in the out of a bottle that is a flesh tone. This will be made from rat brown from Coat d'Arms. It's a tiny bit of black added just to darken it off a bit, and the highlighting process will involve adding increasing amounts of mummy robes from Army Painter, which is a slightly pinky white, and take that up to an almost pure mummy robes finish for the highest highlights. I've added some mummy robes now. And really that first layer is just going to be for the deepest recesses, such as eye sockets and between the fingers. So I'm on the third layer. Again, keeping the layers very thin, lots of water in the mix. And each time I add more of the mummy robes to it, I'm making my points of contact with the brush smaller. And concentrating on knuckles on the hands, cheekbones, nose, chin. The bottom lip will stay darker than the top lip, so it won't have any more paint now. I'll keep adding more mummy robes. So hopefully you can see how the face has been developing there. Almost pure mummy robes going on the tip of the nose there. And a couple of dots for the cheeks. I've been in there with my white for the eyes and then my pen as well that I used in the last video, Staedtler 0.05mm. The next thing will be to add some glazing to the face. I'm going to thin some Army Painter Field Grey and apply that for stubble first of all. And then thin some of the Carmine red we used earlier and paint that just under the cheekbones for a hint of ruddiness in the cheeks. Here we are after one pass of the Field Grey stubble and Carmine red on the cheeks. So it's very fine change there. So a second bit of the Field Grey going on. You hardly notice it, it's so thin. And that's what we need. We don't want to be drowning the area in colour at this stage. Just Carmine red. Adding a bit of colour back in there. A few more details I'm going to try and pick out. You would actually have a design on the front of the brass over the straps here, featuring the regiment number. So I'm not going to do a 39 on this side, that's too small. But a bit of coat d'arms chestnut ink in the centre will kind of replicate the almost horseshoe design that you sometimes see on these. With a bit of highlighting with the gold again, we'll redefine that. Other details that I'm adding on. Regiment number 39, I've painted that onto the pack there. It'd be too fiddly and too difficult to do on camera. And on the canteen, British Ordnance marking, so a B and an O with an arrow in the centre. Might tidy that up a wee bit. I think as well that the wood grain is not as effective as it could be on the musket. So I have some tan earth from Vallejo. And I think some more shading might be needed for the red of the jacket, so I'll come to that once I've finished the wood grain. I've got some Games Workshop purple wash. And that's going to help to shade the red a bit more. I often find when getting towards the end of a model you start to see all the colours together, different areas you've been working on, and you realise that some areas are lacking a little. I might thin this out with some more water and add into the depths of the folds as well. So I think the gold horseshoe shape on the brass over the straps is coming up well. Just a little bit of extra shading to the red is bringing more of a contrast from light to shadow. And I think even could afford some tiny highlights in white on the cloth. The cloth of the overalls, that is. Quite often I find when I'm working on a model that I'll go back to areas again and again just to really finalize things. When I'm working at display level, I should say. Perhaps doesn't make for the most intuitive tutorial, me jumping around. So I apologise if it's been a bit hard to follow. But the process doesn't always lend itself to a kind of mechanical process as it does on the standard and high detail. Bringing out a bit of Coat d'Arms ink armour wash, which is a black ink. So I reckon there's some areas around the lace and the straps could do with further definition. The finishing touches continue. I'm back using the chestnut ink. It's deepening the shade in a couple of areas on the creases in the trousers, such as that hole in the knee and the lower part of the seam, and up around the folds at the top of the trouser. Round about the knapsack there as well. Re-establishing the finest highlights on the red. This time I'm using some Foundry British Redcoat Light. Which is almost orange in colour. Such a light scarlet. We'll see how this looks when it dries, and we may be able to call this one finished. Hi all. Here's the shot that counts, I think. Left to right as you're looking at it, standard detail, high detail and display detail. I hope that it's fairly easy to see the progression between the levels of detail, and that there's a more smooth transition between shade and highlight, and that the faces become much more alive as progress through the finishes. And as a smarter man than me once said, if you can get faces and bases right, your models will look fantastic. Obviously, I haven't done the bases and the client will be doing them. Let's spin these guys around. Obvious difference is the addition of the 39 on the pack, the regiment number that would be painted on. But I think as well that you can see again the transitions are smoother as the highlighting is added to the black. And if you look at the overalls again, a nice smooth finish. So I know this video has been particularly long, and my process is a bit stop-start, going back to different areas and adding to them. But I think when you're taking your time over a model, you really need the whole thing to come together before you can decide if any particular area has reached its finishing point. I've used a ridiculous number of paints as well. Keeping things fairly to a minimum by doing some blending between your lighter colours and your darker colours means you can get away without having a full range of paints. But, you know, you're going to make your decision as you paint these models whether you want tabletop standard, slightly more detail, or the best finish you can achieve. And that's really only a decision for the painter or the client if you're commissioning someone to paint for you. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon with another video. If you've got any comments about what processes I've used, please leave them below, and I'll try and get back to them as soon as I can. Thanks again. Bye bye.